What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with our weekly DFS live stream for week 3, the main slate, a 13-gamer coming up, a lot of strategy, some stacks we got to talk about here, and frankly, my second favorite hour of the week. My favorite hour definitely has to be the golf live chat, right? It's been around for a while. It's been a little bit more steady for us. People a little bit more loyal over there, but hey, we're building up this football channel, trying to get more people in here. So, as of right now, still my second favorite hour of the week. Going to go game by game to get you ready for this weekend. Talk about some of the injuries. We'll talk about all of the game scripts, where a lot of the chalk is going to be likely on Sunday, and some of the last second injury designations that we might need to keep an eye on. There's a few players that went from no designation to a Q tag here on the Friday, and a few players that were rolled out. So a couple of moving parts that we're going to have to touch on, like a Rondell Moore, for example. A few wide receivers in that 3 and 4K range were rolled out here over the last 3 or 4 hours. So a lot to touch on. So let's get this thing started. I'll share my screen, and as we always do, just go game by game, right? Break this down in as easy a format as possible. So the first game we're going to touch on is this Baltimore at Patriots game. Usually the Patriots play the Ravens play the Patriots relatively tough. They've had a good record against them over the last 5 to 6 years. In the playoffs, you've had them knock them off as underdogs. Lamar Jackson has seemed to figure out how to get past Bill Belichick, who's a mastermind at taking away your number one asset, except when it's a running quarterback, right? He's had a lot of troubles with those sort of players in the past. And that's why you see him favored by 2.5 points. And that is despite being on the road. So you have the 1-1 Ravens, the 1-1 Patriots just squeaked past my Pittsburgh Steelers there last weekend. An ugly game. Neither offense wanted to win it. And I think that the rightful favorite here is definitely the Ravens, but I think it should be a little bit more severe. I could see it being a true 4.5, maybe even closer to like a full touchdown favorite right there, because Lamar Jackson, again, has had Bill Belichick's number in the past. I think they're by far the better team this year. And despite being on the road, I think that they should be larger favorites. J.K. Dobbins has not played yet. He is still questionable. So I'd say he's probably a 50-50 on whether he's going to play this week. Even if he plays, I don't think he's going to be healthy enough to go ahead and fire up. More as a change of pace back for them. I still think that you'll get guys like, what's his name? Guy they just brought in, Kenyon Drake, is still going to get a few touches. He got a lot of targets out of the backfield. Mike Davis also saw a lot of the goal line work, or when they had 3rd and short, 4th and 1, that sort of thing. They were putting Mike Davis in there. So J.K. Dobbins, even if he comes back, I don't think he's going to be that clear number one yet. So I would be a little bit hesitant there. Isaiah Likely is going to be questionable. At this point is a game time decision. He's also the backup tight end there. So it's not that fantasy relevant. I guess if you were playing the showdown slate, might be a little bit more there. Looking at the Patriots, not a ton of fantasy relevant injuries. You have Jacoby Myers, who's been questionable the entire year, yet he's also suited up the entire year. To this point is still questionable going into the weekend, but based on what we've seen through the first 2 weeks, we would expect him to be able to suit it up there too. So when we look over here on Draftkings and we try to consider some of the stacking options, let's do it team by team. With the Ravens, it's always an interesting conundrum when it comes to Lamar Jackson. He's somebody who you saw last week post a 40-point performance. So expect him to be a little bit popular, and he's averaging 34.9 fantasy points per game. But he's hard to stack, right? Because last week, it wasn't somebody like Mark Andrews who had that nuclear performance. It was spread around a little bit. Guys like Duvernay caught yet again another touchdown. Bateman still got plenty of work. A lot of Lamar Jackson's production came on the ground. So if you wanted to run him naked, go out there, not even worry about a stack at all, I think you could go ahead and do it. But I have better ideas this week. He's still getting right around. Let's see. Let me check my ownership over here on another tab. Again, if you're looking for all of my ownership, all of my projections, they are on my Patreon. I will be referencing it throughout the video. And as of right now, I have Lamar Jackson at 5.5% projected owned. So that's not the highest. Obviously Josh Allen, who's $200 more expensive, is nearly twice as highly owned, but that's getting up there with guys like a Patrick Mahomes. He's significantly lower owned than somebody like a Jalen Hurts too, who's kind of up there with a Josh Allen, but that's higher owned than Justin Herbert, higher owned than a Kyler Murray, who are also significantly cheaper than Lamar Jackson. You have guys like Joe Burrow, who are lower owned, who are a clear $1,400 less expensive than a Lamar Jackson. So you're paying up for him this week. He's $8,000. There's that to deal with. and then some of the issues with stacking, which if you were to do it, right, I would recommend going with Mark Andrews. But we've seen over the first few weeks, it's been random guys that are going off, right? First week, it was Devin Duvernay. You had Rashad Bateman, who scored, 24 fantasy points last game. He had a decent game, Mark Andrews, but it wasn't nuclear, right? 28 fantasy points at his price tag was well above value, but it wasn't slate breaking. It's sometimes hard to get that connection right. And last year, just to point this out, they don't have the game logs on here, but last year, Mark Andrews had multiple 40-point games. If you remember, one of them was on prime time. One of them was for a main slate, so you could have taken advantage of that correlation. So it certainly is within his range of outcomes, but I'd rather take a chance when he's not playing a New England defense, which in general is pretty stingy. You saw that against the Steelers. And then again, coming in at relatively high ownership because of his performance last week. Looking at the Patriots, I think he'd be a fool to go out there and try and stack Mac Jones. I thought he'd be a lot better this year. I took him in a few best ball drafts. And to this point, I've been proven wrong, right? So I'm not going to go out there and be stubborn about it. I hope that he turns it around, but I'm going to wait and see until I jump back on board. I mean, it's been more than alarming over the first few weeks. The Steelers defense has been a lot more porous since TJ Watt went down. And even after he went down last week, they still had a hard time moving the ball. Their best work was all on the ground, right? So when they had Ramondre Stevenson, when they had Damian Harris just going out there, ripping off 5 to 6 yards a carry, that's when they were able to score, move the ball, take a lot of time off the clock. But when they had to rely on Mac Jones, like they did for a lot of the first half, it was an absolute train wreck. So, with that in mind, I expect them to be a lot more rush heavy going into the future than what we've seen at this point. So yeah, Mac Jones, probably going to be a fade for me. That whole offense, I mean, Damian Harris at $5,600, it's a reasonable price. Same thing with Ramondre Stevenson. With Stevenson, you definitely have to get him into the end zone. He's touchdown dependent, if I've ever seen a player that's touchdown dependent. But still, at $4,800, if he falls into the end zone twice, gets you, let's say, 17 to 18 fantasy points, maybe 20 if you get really lucky. Within Ramondre Stevenson, that can make his way to the optimal. But I don't love the game in general. And if I'm going to pick spots, it's going to be just individual players, no sort of game stack. Let's go on to the Kansas City at Indianapolis game next. So let's bring that up. Also look at the game total here. So got some whiskey in the cup here. It's a much bigger cup. A lot of my smaller whiskey glasses are unfortunately dirty right now. I need to run a load of dishes there, but hey, we'll make it work. It's a Players Championship cup. Players Championship isn't for another 6 months, but I can't wait for it. TVC Sawgrass is my happy place. Alrighty, so I like this game here. And so does everyone else. So it's going to be an ownership situation. It's going to be a spot of quite a bit of chalk. So we have to focus on it. We've got to talk through who the pieces of chalk are going to be. And then on Sunday, based on where ownership goes, right, it could go up on Sunday. It could go down over the next day and a half as people maybe see that it's chalk and get a little bit cooler on it. Or sometimes people see that other people are on this game and just it becomes a snowball effect where everyone feels like they have to get access to it and it gets a little bit out of hand. So we're going to have to keep tabs on this game, make sure that the ownership isn't going crazy. You have a 50.5 point total. Kansas City is favored by 5.5, which this is yet another game where I think the spread should probably be larger, probably closer to a full touchdown there for Kansas City. The Colts, first of all, have had a lot of trouble to this point. They're 0-1-1. The tie in week 1 was ugly against Houston. Last week, the loss was, self-explanatory. You can't be losing that sort of game, especially with that kind of score line. And you thought that Matt Ryan would be an upgrade over Carson Wentz. And I suppose we're being proven wrong at this point. Carson Wentz is being relatively efficient over there in Washington. And now that Matt Ryan's over here in Indy, it looks like maybe it's the offensive coordinator, maybe it's the just system in general, the offensive weapons that they have at their disposal. They aren't nearly as efficient as they were before. And a huge player that's been hurt by that is Jonathan Taylor. I mean, last week playing from behind, he just couldn't get touches, and he's going to be a piece of mega chalk this week. So despite his, lackluster performance, I still have him coming in at 9.6% projected ownership, which is not the highest on the slate, but it's still higher than Christian McCaffrey, who's up there at $8,800. It's still higher than Derrick Henry, who's a whole $900 less expensive. It's more than Austin Eckler, who's there at $8,000. And the only players that are higher owned than Jonathan Taylor that I'd consider like an elite level running back would be Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon that are in that 7K range. That's kind of like the Goldilocks zone when it comes to running backs, right? You don't want to go up to that elite tier, but if you're being relatively balanced, guys like Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon fit into those builds beautifully. So that's why you're always going to see them a little bit higher owned. But in terms of the elite tier guys, he's your highest owned running back. And a lot of it just comes down to the game total. People see 50.5 anytime it gets over 40, right? If it was 49.5, people would be a lot less excited about it than they are there at 50.5. And the reality is it's just a 1 point difference between those two implied totals. Psychology can be a bitch. That's how I'll go out there and say. People really overreact to some of the situations that they see. But the fact of the matter here is, there's going to be pieces of chalk like that maybe aren't worth it to me because the Colts should be playing from behind. Like I said, I think it should be closer to a 7-point spread. And if he's going to be a piece of chalk up top, that's just a piece that I'm going to pivot from. Now, looking at Kansas City, I think they're going to absolutely roll here. It's a dome game playing over there in Indianapolis. So beautiful weather. He's not going to be dealing with any sort of adverse conditions, which early in the year isn't something that we're always worrying about. But on Thursday Night Football, it was right with the Steelers-Browns. I was quite blustery. You saw it with the kicking. It was an absolute nightmare out there. But even some of the downfield passes were affected by that. No sort of effect in Lucas Oil Stadium. Taking a look at the stacks here, I talked about Indy, right? I'm not the biggest fan of Jonathan Taylor. I think he might be bad chalk next week. At least he's going to be higher owned than he should be. It's Jonathan Taylor. He's more than capable of going out there and nuking a slate, scoring like 30, 40 fantasy points. But in a negative game script, we saw last week exactly what can happen if they're playing from behind. He doesn't get the touches that he needs. Matt Ryan, I don't love stacking. They'll be playing from behind, so he's going to have to throw a whole lot. So maybe looking at their week 1 stats are a little bit better, right? When he threw 50 times rather than 30, he's still only completed right around like 53. You can see 64% in week 1. So it's not like he was an elite level accuracy guy. In terms of efficiency, averaging right around 6.5 attempts, yards per attempt. They're in both both contests. So it's not like he was wildly efficient there in week 1. It's just that the sample size was there, right? They weren't getting killed. The clock wasn't being ran down their throat. If they can keep this even remotely competitive, I'd expect him to throw closer to 50 times than the 30 times that we saw in week 1. And if he can score a touchdown, be a little bit more efficient, have closer to like a 75 to 80 passer rating, he could get there. I just don't love it. I'd much rather take the Kansas City side. So if you're going to take a piece of this chalky game, I think you have to stick to the bread and butter. The guys that we know are going to go out there and produce. That would be a Patty Mahomes, a Travis Kelce, two of the surest things that we have in fantasy football. I consider getting the Juju, MVS. They're all reliable targets. Or if you want to just skip the stack, try and take a single piece from this game, you could go to Kelce. He would be a great little one-off there. Or Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's seen a lot of usage over this year. And one thing that I pointed out going into the year was he was going to be a lot more efficient. He was 30 pounds lighter last year. It was due to a medical condition. He's gotten that worked out. He's 30 pounds heavier now, a lot more muscle on his frame. You can tell that he's a lot more explosive, and you've seen that with his averages. 6 yards a carry in week 1, 9 yards a carry there in week 2, is getting plenty of targets out of the backfield. You can see he scored 2 touchdowns in week 1. And last week, without a touchdown on the ledger, still put up 15 points. So you'll love to see that. Had 74 rushing yards. So it's not like he even got to the 100-yard bonus, and that's how he got to 15 fantasy points. He's doing it by being extremely efficient. And I expected that. He's in a very high total offense, maybe the most efficient offense in all of the NFL. He's going to be an extremely efficient player, and I really prioritize him in this game. So I had to pick one piece that I like the most. The Chiefs stack makes a lot of sense. I think it's actually good chalk there, worth eating, but I really like getting to Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a one-off. Moving on to the next game, we've got New Orleans at the Carolina Panthers, which really, just from the surface, seems like a defensive slog, and the over-under reflects that, right? 41 points in terms of implied total, 2.5-point spread towards the Saints, which I would agree with there. A lot of injuries to talk about. So we have Alvin Kamara, who's the huge question mark there. Taysom Hill's questionable, which isn't huge, but Jameis Winston being questionable, their starting quarterback, is a huge deal. He's dealing with 4 fractures in his back. Now, he played last week, but he got clobbered. He got hit multiple times. He looked extremely uncomfortable at times out there in the field. You have Kamara, who's down. Jameis, who most likely will play, but who knows if he gets hit the wrong way. You're going to have Taysom Hill potentially going in at quarterback, but he's questionable himself. So there's a lot of moving parts going on with the Saints there. And on the Panthers, nothing to speak of, right? No injuries. There's a few on the defensive side. One we knew about a while ago, but Dante Jackson and Stanley Thompson Oliver, both questionable. Nothing fantasy relevant, nothing that's going to sway us in one direction or the other. But when we're looking at a value perspective, New Orleans could have a ton of it. Kamara's out. Melvin Ingram, the second, could go out there and get quite a few touches at $5,500. Going on to wide receiver, I mean, there's no one hurt at that position necessarily, but you're going to have a cheap quarterback, right? If you end up having Jameis and Winston both going down, I mean, Andy Dalton is going to have to start for this team. He's $5,100, and he loves throwing it a ton. Anytime we've seen him come in for teams, he's gone out there, kind of been a little bit of a gunslinger. And though he hasn't been efficient, I mean, I don't know. Chris Olave at $4,500, I don't hate. $4,800 Jarvis Landry, who's scoring 14 points a game. I really have to say I don't really mind that all that much. Those are all the sort of guys that I think I'm going to get to. So Jarvis Landry, little one-offs from the New Orleans side, I think are worth getting to. I think Mark Ingram, especially if Alvin Kamara is out, might be a nice little source of value at the running back position. Going to the flip side, looking at Carolina, I don't like the stack, right? But I do like pieces of this game, right? It's a low total game, 41 points. It's not like we want to be getting here in bunches. I don't see it shooting out. I don't have it getting to 55, 60 points all that often. But McCaffrey, they're trying to get him the ball more often. You could tell last week, right? 5 more carries than he saw in week 1. Still only saw 5 targets. But coach went out there, offensive coordinator, even Baker himself, all of them were quoted as saying that Christian McCaffrey has to get the ball more. And I know it's coach speak from time to time, but he really does have to get the ball more. He's what makes the Carolina offense tick. By far their most efficient player. When he's playing well, Carolina ends up winning games, and they have to win a game at some point. They've looked dreadful to this point. They get a cupcake matchup, right? If they end up having Jameis out, I actually like the Carolina side a little bit more, especially if Taysom Hill is out too and they're dealing with Andy Dalton at quarterback, because that means that Carolina is more than likely going to win this game, right? They're going to go from underdogs to likely favorites if both of them are rolled out. Again, Jameis is more than likely going to play. So just, this is a little bit of a pipe dream here, but if you end up getting him rolled out, I would love CMC. I mean, he would become a priority for me because they're going to be playing from ahead. It's going to be a lot easier for them to feed him the ball. It's hard to feed CMC when you're playing from 2 touchdowns down or 17 points down, something like that. It's a lot easier to get him 25, 30 touches in a game when you can run out the clock, or when you're playing from ahead and can be a little bit more conservative. So I like CMC even more if you get that injury situation. At wide receiver, I don't really love anybody in this game. I talked about Olave. We talked about Landry a little bit. The lower tier guys are lower tier for a reason, aren't even seeing usage. Robbie Anderson has been a surprise to this point, but I don't expect that to be something that's sustainable. DJ Moore, if anything, is just getting cheaper and cheaper. And at this point, you see he's what, 5,600. He started at $6,000, which people argued in week 1 was already too cheap. He was 5,700 last week, didn't really do anything, scored a touchdown, but still only 43 receiving yards. That's not going to get it done. Maybe this is the week he gets you that 60, 70-yard touchdown, right? I know it's a pipe dream, but he's that sort of player. I mean, over the last 2 years in fantasy, he's been a top 15 wide receiver. So must we forget that he's still technically like a wide receiver too? A top tier wide receiver too at that when it comes to fantasy football. And at $5,600, I mean, it's not the worst value in the world. I might see myself getting there. We talked about some of the other guys in New Orleans, but in general, just an ugly game to begin with. You see Josh Killiam does not seem to like CEH. He's played unbelievably well to this point. So if you're saying that based on last year, he literally had some sort of like degenerative disease where like he had to have something removed from his gut that he couldn't control. So if you're basing that on last year's performance, bro, I don't know what to say about that. Josh says, why would they throw it 50 times? They're going to try and run the ball and control the clock. They're not going to be playing from ahead. So you're saying that hoping that Indy goes out there and is winning by a touchdown. When Mahomes goes out there and throws for, let's say, 2 touchdowns in the first quarter, they're winning 21-7. They can't run the ball 50 times. They're going to have to throw the ball 50 times. So when we look at the spread, right, I expect Kansas City to absolutely murder Indianapolis here, right? Indy's 0-1-1. They tied Houston. They lost last week to Jacksonville. They look like dog shit, right? Under Matt Ryan. Why would you think that they wouldn't throw 50 times? Like, well, you think they're going to go out there and dominate against Kansas City, who's looked unbelievable to this point? Yeah, dude, I don't know what to say to you. You seem just like a little bit delusional, saying that CEH stinks, and then saying like, oh, why would they not do that? Dude, they're going to kill him. It's everyone in the industry agrees with that too. That's not really a hot take, to be quite frank with you. Eric says if the Ravens are out in front, Lamar is less likely to run. What do you think? Yes, for sure, because he's not going to risk it. And when he went out there and scored that 80-yard touchdown, I was a little bit surprised too. He's not the sort of player, or at least going into the year, he kind of said that he was going to take it a little bit safer this year because of his contract dispute, right? He doesn't want to risk injury. He knows that if he can get through this year, he's going to get life-changing money. But if he goes down with an ACL tear, no one's going to invest in him for like a 5-6 year contract. No one's going to give him the guaranteed money that he's looking for. So in general, Eric, I tend to agree with you. So I guess that's another reason not to play him this week. But yeah, he's also going to get plenty of ownership. He's at an expensive price tag now, and the matchup isn't ideal either. I know he's had a lot of success against the Patriots in the past, but it's still Bill Belichick. He's still one of the best defensive coaches that you have in the league. And yeah, the CEH hater out there, bro, I honestly don't know what you're saying. Like, look at his numbers this year. He's averaging like 8 yards a carry, 10 yards a catch. He's averaging well over 15 fantasy points. Last year, he was literally dealing with a degenerative disease. Look it up. It's like documented and whatnot out there. He's 30 pounds heavier now. You can't look at that, right? If he was on your fantasy team last year and you're just mad because he had a bad year, then look at yourself in the mirror, bro. It's not that serious. It's just a fantasy league, right? Like it's not that serious. That's what I'll say. Let's move on to the Houston versus Chicago game. This is another low total. In fact, even lower total than the last, just 39 points there. The Bears are the favorites, which, I guess given that the opponent is Houston, makes sense. They're the home team. You get that little 3-point advantage there. Davis Mills versus Justin Fields, just low volume offenses. The Justin Fields side, you're just hoping he gets you some rushing production, can get you to the optimal lineup. But in general, I hate this game. There's not a ton of injuries to open up value. The only injuries for the Texas side are at tight end. So you have Brevin Jordan who's out, Pharaoh Brown who's probably going to play, but if he's out, it's not like I'm running to the window to play a minimum price tight end for Houston, Texas. Going over there with Chicago, not a lot of fantasy relevant injuries. Velus Jones Jr., their rookie wide receiver, still hasn't played to this point. So that's not going to change anything. He hasn't been in the lineup to begin with. When Ryan Griffin's out and he's their backup tight end. So Cole Kmet, by the way, who's their starting tight end, has 0 catches through his first 2 games. So even with Ryan Griffin being out, you go, oh, maybe Cole Kmet's going to get a few more looks. No, he's gone 0 through the first 2 weeks. So I wouldn't expect that to change either. So when we look at this from the fantasy perspective, the first thing that, points out to me is Cole Kmet is going to start catching balls. This guy is way too talented to go out there and not be targeted much over the first 2 weeks. In fact, he had 1 target, no catches week 1, 1 target, no catches there in week 2. He's still $3,400. So it's not even like we're getting a price decrease on him, but he's going to be like 1.5% owned. Let me check my ownership projections, actually. I'll get you an exact number. So at $3,400, Cole Kmet is 1.7% projected owned as per my last run of ownership. So if you're looking to get any sort of leverage, as a one-off in this game, it's guys like Cole Kmet that make sense to me. The guys that are going to be a little bit higher owned, like a Darnell Mooney. There's going to be people that get to David Montgomery. Looking at the Houston side, a lot of people are going to be willing to get to Brandon Cooks as a one-off. I'm going to avoid them. Their optimal percentages in a game with a 39-point implied total are a lot lower than, let's say, 7-8%, which is going to be your median ownership on those 4 to 5 players that I mentioned. So I'm just going to try and stick to the low-owned, maybe diamonds in the rough that we can get there. On the Texas side, Dameon Pierce, he hasn't seen a lot of usage to this point, but did have 15 touches last week. Only averaged 4.6 yards a carry, didn't score a touchdown, so only put up 8.7 points. But if he can be a little bit more efficient, 15 to 20 touches in a game is what you're looking for. And the Bears defense, though it is stout against the run, aren't impermeable to long plays, right? Busted coverages, all that sort of fun stuff. All it takes is 1 play for somebody at that price tag to get you into an optimal lineup, right? What is he? $5,000. He's going to put up those 20 touches. So you're thinking like an 8 to 10 point floor, like he posted last week. He scores a touchdown, gets you to like 16 to 18 points. Maybe it's a long play, right? Like I mentioned, a busted coverage. He gets you 30, 40 yards there. He has more than enough ability to get to an optimal. And it's guys like Pierce, and then I mentioned Cole Kmet on the other side. They're not sexy plays by any means, but I'd much prefer getting to those sort of plays that are low owned than the chalk in such a low total game. Moving on to Buffalo and Miami, we'll bring up the injury report here because there are a few guys to touch on. Most notably, off the top of my head, we have Gabe Davis that we're going to have to talk about, who at this point is still questionable, but Gabe Davis playing would be a huge benefit for the Bills. They're going into, I'd say, the best game of this entire week. It's the highest total game, 5-point spread favoring the Bills. The Bills have been great in their own right, but Mike McDaniel and these Miami Dolphins are getting a lot of hype, and I think it's deservingly so. They have Jalen Waddle. Tyreek Hill has looked like the killer that he was over there in Kansas City, so it wasn't just good old Andy Reid cooking up plays for him. Probably had a lot to do with his speed and explosiveness, but it's hard to pick a winner here. I mean, you have the Miami Dolphins at home, right? So you're baking in those 3 points there. I think the 5 points for the Bills might be a little bit aggressive. I mean, Mike McDaniel has looked like an absolute mastermind to this point. So you have Gabe Davis, who's the huge question mark in terms of the Bills. On the Miami Dolphins side, not as much to speak of. Cedric Wilson, who's like their 4th string wide receiver, is dealing with an injury. Hunter Long's like 3rd string tight end, dealing with an injury too. But maybe the biggest question mark is Xavier Howard. Xavier Howard might be the best defensive player on the Dolphins. If he's out, that's going to open up a lot of room for Stephon Diggs. So if Diggs is dealing without Howard shadowing him, expect him to have an absolutely monster game like we saw last week, where he went out there and scored like 40 fantasy points. So just to give you an idea here, what did he score last week? Yeah, 47 fantasy points. He could go out there and produce that same sort of way if he doesn't have Xavier Howard out there. So that's something that I'd keep an eye on, just the injury report for the Dolphins. In terms of stacking, they're looking at the chalkiest of all the chalk games. So looking at the ownership at quarterback, Josh Allen is 9.8%. Looking at Tua's ownership, he's got just 4.4%. So if you wanted to stack one of the two teams, I think maybe taking the Tua side would be the side that I would go out there and say to take, because a couple of reasons for it. They've looked extremely pass heavy to this point. Almost all of their touchdowns have come through the air, and they've gone into the red zone. Mike McDaniel has found a way to get the ball out of Tua's hands and into some of those skill position wide receivers. On the other side, the Bills, last year they ran the ball a lot, right? They had Zach Moss vulturing a lot of touchdowns. Devin Singletary got quite a bit of usage in the red zone. And though Josh Allen's been a killer to this point, I'd argue that the Dolphins offense might be a little bit more fantasy friendly than what we see over there in Buffalo. And Buffalo has the better defense. They're the better team. We know that. But if Miami's going to be playing from behind, which is more than likely going to be the case, and they're still only going to be 4.4% owned because, first off, he's more expensive this week. And nobody thinks that Tua can go out there and have 2 good weeks in a row. Maybe it's more Mike McDaniels than it is Tua. Maybe Tua just needed to have weapons on his offense. That is a more than reasonable take to have. I think that there's upside there. Josh Allen, if you want to eat a chalky stack, get to it, but you're going to have to play like 25 to 30% to get the leverage that you're looking for. Stephon Diggs as a one-off, I think, is a must play if Gabe Davis is out. If Xavier Howard is out, Stephon Diggs might be like a 60 to 70% plus owned to play in my player pool, just because, I mean, the matchup would be ideal then, and you'd be dealing with all the volume in the world once again if Gabe Davis is out. So I'll be keeping an eye on that personally. Tight end, Dawson Knox is also questionable. So if he were to be down too, I mean, Stephon Diggs would be a borderline lock. I mean, if I'm not playing, Josh Allen stacks, I'd still have all the Stephon Diggs in the world in that sort of situation. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. If I'm stacking Tua, getting to Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle make a lot of sense. Mike Gesicki at $4,300, also a player that I'm going to have my eye on because he's cheap enough to kind of help you pay up for somebody like a Tyreek Hill if you decide to take him as your first option at wide receiver, and to try and take some of the top end running backs. So we'll talk about a few of them as we get to some of the next games here. But yeah, in general, it's a chalky game. It's a high total game. A lot of it ends up making sense to me, but I'm trying to pick my spots, right? I like the Dolphins side that's a little bit lower owned, and then maybe just sticking to guys like Stephon Diggs. Let's move on to the Lions in Vikings game now. So let me go ahead and bring that up on Gamecast. Looks like there's a question down there. Eric says this Buffalo game might be high owned, extremely high owned, very chalky. Yeah, Josh Allen's like nearly 10% owned, a little bit lower on the other side, but yeah, in general, you're asking a whole lot. If you're going into them hoping that you're going to be unique, you're going to have to differentiate quite well elsewhere. He also said Buffalo secondary is hurt for 2 rookies. Yeah, so the Dolphins are going to have even more reason to go out there and play well. But even with the hurt secondary, Buffalo is still the #1 fantasy defense against opposing quarterbacks. So take that with a grain of salt, right? They've still had a lot of guys down, but they've been unbelievable even in those players' absences. So yeah, definitely right there. You're right about that, Eric. But they've seemed to figure it out regardless. That's for sure. We have our second highest game total on the slate. So you had, those first 2 that we talked about. This is arguably the most intriguing of the bunch because Kirk Cousins is going to be the chalk here. People are going to be getting to him in bunches. I believe he was the highest projected on quarterback the last time I checked. Let's see. Second highest on quarterback. So I have him at 9.5%, which is just 0.3% less than Josh Allen. If there's one player that I can tell you I am 100% fading, it is Kirk Cousins. Won't have him in a single lineup. I'm going to have pieces of that offense, but Kirk Cousins as chalk, I mean, even coming off the disaster that he had there in primetime, you think that people might be a little bit more hesitant to get there, but all indications are at this point that he's going to just be mega high on, just ridiculous at this point. Something that's going to be a clear fade spot for me. But when we look at the other side with Jared Goff, he's interesting, right? He's got all the stacking options in the world with Amon-Ra St. Brown. You can use DeAndre Swift if you want to. He's got plenty of usage out of the backfield. You can get the Josh Reynolds. He's more of a tertiary option. TJ Hawkinson, who nobody seems to want to play at this point, still getting plenty of targets over the first few weeks. Just hasn't been that efficient with it. I really, really like the Dolphins. I almost said the Dolphins. Thinking about last game there, the Detroit side here. So let's talk through it. So getting to Detroit, first off, cheap quarterback, $5,800. You'd love to see that. Gives you a little bit more flexibility with the rest of your stack. Amon-Ra St. Brown, the sun god, is an absolute god when it comes to his fantasy production. Put up 40 fantasy points last week, is $7,200. Great option there. TJ Hawkinson, if he plays, would be great, $4,200. Also relatively cheap. So if you went with a Goff, Hawkinson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown stack, you'd still have plenty of flexibility for the rest of your lineup there. And taking buybacks, there's buybacks galore, right? Just because I hate Kirk Cousins doesn't mean that I hate this offense, because Dalvin Cook could very well go out there and have a rebound game against the worst fantasy defense against running backs in the league. I think that's the target that I really want to get to there on the Vikings side. Or just taking Justin Jefferson. He's expensive as all hell, but he also can post you that 30 to 35 fantasy point performance. So I don't like the Kirk Cousins stack. I think that you can find plenty of other stacks across the board that can get you there as well. But I do love a lot of pieces of this offense. It's extremely concentrated to begin with. One of the best offenses to stack typically in the NFL, but not when they're going to go out there and be mega chalk. Let's move on to, I believe, a couple more 1 o'clock games. Again, 13 game slate. We've got a lot of them to break down here. Bengals at the Jets. Let me bring that up. We'll talk through some of the injuries and see if there's any questions out there. Let's see. No questions yet. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to go ahead and toss them down below and see what we've got. So over under here is 45 points, touchdown favorite for the Bengals. The Jets were touchdown underdogs against the Browns. I believe actually a little bit less than a touchdown, but still sizable underdogs against the Browns, and pulled it out of their hat there with down 13 points with a few minutes left. They're a tough team, clearly one of the better coached teams in the NFL. I have to give Saleh a ton of credit down there. He's completely changed the culture for the New York Jets. Like 4 or 5 years ago, they were a laughing stock. Now a lot of the players there are buying in. You can tell that they're competitive. They aren't checking out of games when they're playing from behind. I used to give them a lot of shit. I used to be one of the bigger Jets haters out there. It's easy to hate a New York team, regardless of sport. But at this point, I got to give them a little bit of credit. So 45-point total, 7-point underdogs. They're not the most efficient offense to get to. And this probably isn't the best week to get to them, even though the Bengals are 0-2. But when we get them against a soft defense in a super high total game, which isn't really the case here, the Jets are going to be a team that I'm taking a look at. So I just wanted to touch on that. They're impressing me, especially guys like Garrett Davis. I mean, Garrett Wilson. It's called Garrett Davis. Corey Davis has been pretty decent to this point too. Elijah Moore hasn't been quite as productive as I expected him to be. That's because Wilson and Davis are going out there and smashing. So it's only so much to go around on that offense. And when we get Zach Wilson back for that team, I think they're only going to get even more impressive. So keep an eye on the Jets from a fantasy perspective. Kind of a laughing stock over the last few years, but I don't think they're that anymore. But looking at the Bengals, they're relatively low owned. So when we look at their ownership numbers, Joe Burrow, just 4.7%. He is $6,600. So he's right around a Kirk Cousins, and he's nearly half as owned. In fact, less than half as owned as a Kirk Cousins. They're $100 cheaper. And in terms of your projection, I project Kirk Cousins for 22.7 fantasy points, and I project Joe Burrow for 22.3 fantasy points. So you're talking about a 0.4 point difference. They're in $100 difference in terms of your price in half the ownership for 0.4 points. And you're talking about a team that's favored by a touchdown still, right? So still in a positive game script there, over there with Joe Burrow. Why wouldn't you take him just as a blind pivot, right? Just knowing that, right? They're pretty much the same projection, pretty much the same situation. The game total here, 45 points, a little bit lower. Sure. I mean, it's got that going for it, but you can't tell me that Joe Flacco hasn't looked pretty good to this point. They haven't looked damn impressive. What's to say that this isn't a competitive, relatively high scoring game? Something getting close to like 50, maybe 55 points in terms of the total there. I think that's more than reasonable. And given that he's half as owned as somebody like your Kirk Cousins, don't tell me that it's half the chance that it goes to that sort of outcome. It's not, right? It's maybe closer to like a 60-40 or 65-35 if you want to be a little bit more aggressive about it. But that doesn't dictate the sort of ownership numbers that we're seeing. So I'm going to be not all in on the Burrow stacks here because he's been a little bit rusty to this point, that we'll say, but I definitely think he's worth a few looks. Even with the rust, he posted 26 points in week 1, which was pretty damn decent. 16 points in week 2, which against Dallas was an absolute just laying an egg. I did not expect that. I played him last week too, actually. So ended up hurting me in a few lineups, but I think we got to put that aside, understand that he has a ton of upside there. Even throwing 5 picks again in week 1, scored 26 points. Sorry, 4 picks. Added one there, my bad. Without those picks, he scores 34 fantasy points, right? We got to keep that in mind. That's a nuclear performance. A lot of it's going to go through Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd out there. Maybe you get a few targets through Hayden Hurst too. Who's let's see, what is Hayden Hurst getting to this point? He's getting a lot of targets. He's questionable, so hopefully he plays. But 8 targets week 1, 7 targets last week. That's outrageous. So even in that low total game, he posted, 7 targets, only 24 yards. That's a little bit disappointing, but you love to see that he's getting all those looks from Joe Burrow. So love the Cincy side. In terms of buybacks, there's not a ton to speak of. I would go to wide receiver, though. Elijah Moore is cheaper than Garrett Wilson now. I think that Elijah Moore is going to have himself a few games here. So maybe take Elijah Moore. Corey Davis, hopefully he plays. If he doesn't, even more reason to get the guys like Moore or Garrett Wilson. And at running back, it's hard to tell who's going to get the carries, right? Hall and Carter have almost had a 50-50 split to this point. So I'd probably stick to the wide receivers as some of your buybacks. Let's move on to the Las Vegas at Tennessee game. Let's bring it up, go over here to the next tab and talk about some of the injuries. So it's a 1:00 game, despite, it's because it's in Tennessee. It's not in Las Vegas, but a 2-point spread, one of the closer games. Also, I'd say a medium total, 45.5. So right in the middle of the board when it comes to the scoring. And from the injury perspective, not a lot to speak of. Kyle Phillips, he's the 3rd string wide receiver for the Titans. He's doubtful. So you're going to see a lot of targets going through the rookie Burks, also Robert Woods there. On the other side, a lot of injuries. So Renfro's out. We know that. So Zay Jones is truly going to be the number 2 wide receiver. Josh Jacobs could be out. If that ends up being the case, you have Zamir White. Also Brandon Bolden, get a few touches in that backfield. And it could open up a little bit of value at running back. So at wide receiver, Zay Jones is going to be a value for us. And, the Kyle Phillips thing is pretty much a non-factor. Not really going to change our projections all that much. But let's talk about this one here because last week, the Raiders were everybody's hot topic. Wanted to get to them against the Arizona team. Obviously, a huge letdown for the Raiders last week. My condolences for anybody out there. That was one of the tougher games to watch, to be quite frank with you. But now that they're against Tennessee, who has a tough defense, it's a relatively low total game, right? 45.5 points. no one wants to get to him. Everyone forgot just how concentrated the offense was, how many targets somebody like Davante Adams was getting. 17 targets in week 1. 7 targets, his production last week, he only posted 9 points, scored that 1-yard touchdown, is his floor. 9 points is the lowest of all lows you're going to see for Davante Adams. So even in a low total game, now that he's $8,400, I think that he's still in play. And I think that he could be that sneaky play to get to this week because Davante Adams, just to give you an idea, 8.1% owned. That's lower owned than Justin Jefferson, a whole lot lower owned than somebody like a Cooper Kupp. Taking a look at the quarterback position, you have Derek Carr, who's 4.5% owned. That's lower owned than Jared Goff, also lower owned than somebody like a Tua. Right around the same as a Justin Fields, which, the fact that Derek Carr and Justin Fields are the same ownership level is a little bit ridiculous to me. And then when we take a look at some of the running backs here, first off, really cheap running backs that we might have to consider here. So going down to the bottom, actually, let's just bring it up over here on this screen for you guys. I was on my ownership. Probably easier here on this end. Brandon Bolden, $4,300. He's gotten a lot of targets out of the backfield. You also have Hilliard. You could take on the other side who, even though, look at this, right? Derrick Henry to this point is averaging 8.4 points a game. Because Hilliard had a ridiculous week 1, he's averaging 22 points a game. Now, he scored multiple times. He did get 4 targets out of the backfield, which he turned into 61 yards. But Hilliard's getting a bunch of snaps. He's seeing like a 35% snap share. He could be a little bit of a cheap run back you take if you go with one of those Las Vegas stacks. Derrick Henry's always in play. In terms of the wide receivers, Treylon Burks, especially with Kyle Phillips out, could be worth a look. Nikhil Westbrook-Ikhine isn't getting many looks at all. And at tight end, you do have Darren Waller, Austin Hooper there. I don't know. I'm not the biggest fan of Austin Hooper. Darren Waller, you can always take. So if you're going to go with a Derek Carr stack, you have clear stacking options with going with a Davante Adams or Darren Waller. It'd be hard to fit both into the same lineup. But when you take one of those 1A options for Las Vegas, especially with Hunter Renfrow out, you're going to be locking yourself into probably 20 points there if your stack ends up hitting. And your secondary option might have to be a little bit less expensive, but you have Mac Hollins, not Zay Jones. What am I talking about? Zay Jones is on Jacksonville now. I was thinking of Mac Hollins. He was the guy who was on the Dolphins last year. He actually caught quite a few touchdowns for the Dolphins, which was a little bit surprising. It's Mac Hollins who's going to be the number 2 wide receiver. So my bad. Sorry about that mistake there, boys. He's going to be the number 2. Somebody who's not on the team, Zay Jones, is certainly not going to be the number 2 wide receiver. But worth a few looks. Even look at this. Last week, he played a lot better than week 1. He had 8 targets last week, 66 yards. Renfrow was still in the game when he was getting all of those targets, by the way. Mac Hollins got a majority of those in the first half. Renfrow didn't get hurt until the last drive. In fact, the last catch of the game that he had, went out there, he fumbled. That's how they ended up losing the game. That's where he got injured. So it's not like Mac Hollins got these 8 targets without him in the lineup. If anything, we'd expect that usage rate to go up here for week 3. So I do like Mac Hollins. Again, my apologies. Zay Jones is certainly not playing in that game. Just to make that clear once again there. My bad about that, boys. Next up, we've got the Eagles and Washington, another relatively high total game. That's one thing I have to say about this slate is that we have a lot of shitty games and then a lot of really high total games. Over here, it's lagging for me. Sorry, boys. Hopefully. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Hopefully it's not the stream lagging too. Hopefully it's just my computer being a little bit of a Dumbo right now. Let's see. Looks like the Chrome tab's working, but the Safari tab isn't. So I apologize about that. It's going to be a little bit laggy when we go over here to ESPN. A 47-point total, not a ton of injuries. You have Robinson who's going to be out still dealing with the gunshot wounds. Nothing to speak of otherwise. So in terms of your injury value, it's not going to be there on Sunday unless there's a surprise designation coming out late in the week. 7-point spread. Both teams have been extremely efficient to this point. Both the Eagles through the air, also Washington through the air, which is extremely surprising to me. Averaging 32 points a game. That's not even conceivable to me. When I look at these numbers for Carson Wentz, I don't know. It looks like when he had the really good year with the Philly, went out there did he win the MVP? I got to look this up. 1 second. Did he win the MVP or am I living in an alternate dimension? I have to check this because I feel like he did. Okay, so no, he almost won the MVP, right? He was in the running that year. Yeah, so he didn't win MVP. Good. I'm not living in an alternate dimension. That's good to know. But he's posting numbers like he posted that year when he was in contention for the MVP. Did he figure something out, which is what a lot of people think out there? He's getting played a lot this week, Carson Wentz. Or is he just having a few good weeks? I tend to think that he's probably just having a few good weeks. He's playing well above his ceiling. And if people are going to own him this week like he's a for sure commodity, then I'm just going to have to say no thanks. Because at this point, he's higher owned than an Aaron Rodgers, who is $100 more expensive. In fact, Carson Wentz, in terms of his Aaron Rodgers projection, right, is 4 times higher owned than last year's MVP, right? So if Carson Wentz playing like the MVP candidate of past, right? Not MVP winner. I knew that. I was just have to double check myself there, boys. But against the actual MVP winner from last year, $100 more expensive, and you're telling me that Carson Wentz is 4 times higher owned. I don't care if he's in a 60-point game total. I don't care if Washington has 50 implied points in that game. I'm not playing Carson Wentz 4 times more often than Aaron Rodgers. I don't care if Aaron Rodgers looked dog shit week 1 and Carson Wentz has looked like a god through the first 2 weeks. That is the definition of insanity. So this is what I mean when you have to look at ownership and take salaries with a little bit of a grain of salt. $6,300 for Carson Wentz is ridiculous. It's nutso mode. The guy was like $4,500 consistently last year. And it's not like Washington, the offense that he's now commanding, pun intended there with the Commanders, is like some juggernaut. It's not like he went from like, oh, he's going from Indy to a really good offense now. We should expect a little bit of regression there. No, he went from like pretty dog shit passing offense to arguably an even more dog shit passing offense over there in Washington. So just not my favorite options, to be frank with you. And so I'm probably going to be off of that stack. If you're going to take one-off plays, I think that Logan Thomas makes sense at $3,500. He's extremely cheap. You go to running back, you can take Antonio Gibson, who's still getting a lot of the targets, still getting plenty of targets out of the backfield, which is a little bit surprising. So we take a look at it, 4 targets last week, 8 targets week 1. That 7 catches were huge when it came to his fantasy score, which even with J.D. McKissick getting plenty of third down work, getting 7 targets last week himself, there's plenty of workload to go between the 2 players. So I'd love to see that with Antonio Gibson. If I'm going to take a one-off, he makes quite a bit of sense. Jalen Hurts is not the worst idea to stack at quarterback. I think that people are finally kind of cooling on the ownership there. He's still projecting off the board, but he's no longer the highest owned quarterback. He's 8.3%, a whole 1.5% less than Josh Allen. He's also lower owned than Kirk Cousins, who's only $900 less expensive. And he's only a little bit less than 2% higher owned than Patty Mahomes, who's also $300 more expensive than Jalen Hurts. So in general, I think he's fairly owned. It's relatively high ownership there, but a lot of people that are in these relatively high total games that have been, scoring as efficiently as they have to this point, are going to get ownership, and it makes sense. And there's a few of them this week that I'm going to be willing to get to. So Hurts, I'm going to be stacking him with Goddard quite a bit. He's only $4,700 at wide receiver. Devonta Smith and AJ Brown are both in play. AJ Brown a little bit more expensive, so takes away some of the flexibility that you have at other positions, but probably worth doing in a few stacks. But the same thing with Devonta Smith. He's more than adequate there at $5,200. And though he hasn't had a massive game to this point, the 15 points that he put up last week were a lot better than the goose egg on 4 targets that he had there in week 1. So trending in the right direction. Both players are equally good options, in my opinion. Moving on to the next game, we have Jacksonville and the LA Chargers. And boy, oh boy, do I hope Justin Herbert plays. Herbert might be my sneaky option of the week. The over-under in game total are not set because of, I guess, Herbert's injury. He's that sort of player where, obviously there's a few books that probably have the numbers up, right? But the number fire people, the sports books that they're pulling these lines from, which I'm assuming is probably Draftkings here for what ESPN does, are not pulling lines. So let me actually bring it up. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. Oh, cancel. Don't want to do that. Sorry, boys. I almost took down the stream there. That wouldn't have been good. I'm going to look up the DraftKings odds for this, give you guys an idea of what the live odds here. So DraftKings, NFL odds. And I would assume, right, that they're assuming that Herbert's going to play, that the Chargers are going to be at full strength. Let's go ahead and see what DraftKings is running with at the second. I guess they don't have it up either. Do they? No. Okay, they do have it up. But at this point, they have the Chargers only favored by 3 points and the over-under at 42.5. That's almost implying that Justin Herbert isn't going to play. So that's interesting. Okay, so some of the odds around the industry, you can see that the sports book that they're pulling this from is not expecting Herbert to play, right? Because they took the odds off. And then Draftkings has a -3 line out there. It's even money both directions, obviously. It's the official line here, and it's a 42.5 point total. The total would never be 42.5 if Herbert was going to be in at quarterback. So that's telling to me. And these guys that are doing the odds over there in Vegas know a lot more about what they're talking about than us figureheads over here on YouTube, right? There's a reason why they have casinos, all those expensive buildings built out there in Vegas. It's because they know what the hell they're talking about. So over here with Justin Herbert, who's questionable, maybe that means he's closer to doubtful than we think. So we'll have to keep an eye on this game. If Herbert plays, I love him here. He's going to be super low owned because of all of that uncertainty. The sports books also having the uncertainty on him at this point doesn't give me as much positivity that he's going to go out there and play. But if he does play, I think he's in a great spot. I also think it's a great spot to stack. So if we take a look at why, let's go over here to the DraftKings board, bring up LA. First off, relatively cheap. Justin Herbert, $7,400. That's cheaper than Jalen Hurts, cheaper than Patty Mahomes. So you're getting a little bit of savings there, but also the lowest owned of anybody in that range. And I'm looking at stacking options that also aren't that expensive, right? So if Keenan Allen's out, we know that a lot of targets are going to go through Mike Williams. You saw that in week 2, where he had pretty much all of the downfield targets, 10 targets, 8 catches, 113 yards, and a touchdown. And at tight end, you're also getting quite a few targets to Gerald Everett. You have Donald Parham Jr., who might return this week, but Everett is still going to see a 70 to 80% snap share. Had 10 targets last week, only 4 in week 1, but was able to convert a touchdown there in week 1, so actually scored more fantasy points. I think that the stacking options are doable because Everett's cheap. You can use him in conjunction with a Mike Williams. Palmer's a really good option if Allen is out. So if Allen ends up sitting, you can go with Herbert, Palmer, and Everett as your stack, and then spend up for all of the elite tier running backs that you want, right? You can even take an expensive defense if you feel like it in that sort of lineup. So I do like the Herbert stack if he plays. And as a run back, you can go to Etienne at running back. You can take Robinson. Robinson has been the far more established player, so probably prefer him out of those two names. At wide receiver, Kirk has scored a lot of touchdowns, so he's kind of playing above his head. He's a little bit more expensive now too, so I'm not sure if I'm as bullish on Kirk as I was last week and the week before, where he paid off handsomely for us in our player poll. But Marvin Jones Jr. has more than enough red zone upside. Zay Jones, who plays for the Jaguars, not the Raiders, as I forgot there about 5 minutes ago. He might be worth a few looks too. Moving on to the next game, this Green Bay versus Tampa Bay game. Nobody wants to play. Relatively low total because both defenses are more than adequate, but you also have 2 quarterbacks that are explosive, that when they get it running can go out there, score in bunches, post 28 to 30 points real easily, even against the best of all defenses out there. And it's a close spread, right? So -1 towards Tampa Bay, 42 points in terms of over-under. If you were dealing with a 1-point spread, but this was a 50-point over-under, this would be the chalk game of the week. Everyone would be trying to get action here because for Green Bay, you have a lot of value that's likely to be opened up. You have Sammy Watkins out. So guys like Lazard are going to get even more targets, but also Cobb and Watson are questionable. So Romeo Dubes might be like the nuts value play this week. Now on the other side, you have a few injury concerns as well. You have Leonard Fournette, who's questionable, expected to play though. Perriman, who's questionable. And then a few guys on offense like Godwin, who's not going to be playing. I believe Mike Evans, if my reporting here is correct, is also out for this game. So you just have a ton of value opened up in this game. It could be a higher total than people are thinking based on the fact that both of these quarterbacks are a lot more efficient than people give them credit for. This might be the game to stack this week. And look at this. Oh my God, boys. I just bring up the wide receiver position for this game, right? So I have both of these teams selected. Look at this. Out, questionable, out, questionable. You know what that means? That means that we're going to have a ton of value out here. And the quarterbacks are $6,000 at $6,400 a piece. I mean, Tom Brady's normally like $7,000, $7,500, right? And I get he's had a horrible start to this year. Do we think that's going to continue for both of these quarterbacks? I don't. I think they're going to turn it around a lot sooner than later. And based on all the value that we have at wide receiver, this might literally be the game to get to. I mean, the number one wide receiver for Tampa Bay is going to be Julio if he plays. If he doesn't, it might be Gage. If neither of those guys play, I mean, Perriman. If not, it might legitimately be Scotty Miller, who's $3,800, getting like 10 to 15 targets. Dubes is going to be like the number 2 guy for Green Bay, probably going to get like 7 to 10 targets. What is he? $3,800. At tight end, these guys are going to get a lot of extra looks due to how little targets they have at wide receiver. So Tanyan, going to be a great value at $3,700, Braid at $3,600. If you're looking to like almost punt a stack, like typically these are like Jared Goff level players, right? Or a Carson Wentz that's cheap, and you have all these cheap options that you can take with them in terms of your stack. It's Aaron Rodgers and it's Tom Brady in a 1-point spread against each other. I don't know. I've sold myself. I'm going to be on them in bunches on either side. You have Aaron Rodgers, who's 0.7% owned, one of the lowest owned players in all of the slate at quarterback. And then you have Tom Brady, who's 1.8% owned. So both players being royally overlooked. So I have to get there. From the game theory perspective, the game theory hardo and me just sees a lot of value there. Now, we look at it team by team. We talked about some of the value here at wide receiver. Lazard's going to get a ton of targets. He's a great stacking option with somebody like Aaron Rodgers. Dubes is a piece of value. Also, Robert Tonyan. Over here with Tampa Bay, you could take Leonard Fournette. Like, he's expected to play. He's like one of the more positive injury notes that we have out of this affair. You could take him as a stack with Brady. He gets plenty of production out of the backfield. You could take Brait at tight end, get to a Perriman if he plays, Julio Jones. A lot of it's injury dependent, but a whole lot of value to go around there, it's for sure. And honestly, one of my favorite games on the entire slate to stack, regardless of ownership. Like, 1-point spread, 2 elite quarterbacks, players on both sides that are cheaper than they should be. It's exactly what you're looking for a large MME sort of event. When you want to try and, let's look at this. If I just go ahead and like put all of the games on here, right? At running back, we're trying to take Christian McCaffrey and guys like Derrick Henry as many times as humanly possible. I love getting to Justin Jefferson as a buy-up option. We talked about him as a one-off rather than going with the Kirk Cousins stack. To get to those sort of options, we have to open up salary. And by stacking this Green Bay Tampa Bay game, it opens up all of the salary relief that we could possibly want, right? And those sort of lineups, I mean, just to give you an idea, right? Let's go ahead and just build one of these here. Let's put Tom Brady in the lineup. Let's put Scotty Miller, and let's assume that Julio plays. So let's put him in there. Our buyback, we're going to go over here to Green Bay. We're going to take Dubes, and we're also going to take Tanyan. So we're going to take a double buyback. Actually, we're going to go a little bit more expensive, right? So we're going to start to use some of the salary, right? You can get to Aaron Jones as a little bit more of a premium buyback. If you want to spend up for some of the guys I just like the most on the slate, right? Getting over here to Minnesota. Oh, let's go over here and take Justin Jefferson. That's not going to be a problem in this sort of lineup. Just to get an idea of where we're at in terms of price, let's go to defense. I got to unselect Green Bay over here. There we go. Let's take a cheap defense. Let's go with the Commanders defense. Let's do that. Let's make sure there's no crossover there. So we have our really expensive pay up option there with Justin Jefferson. We have our defense selected, and we still have $5,900 remaining, right? So because we went to the cheaper stack, and I mean, we still took Julio. It's not like we're taking guys that are pure punts at $3,000, right? Scotty Miller is going to be like the number 2, maybe number 1 wide receiver for Tampa Bay. Dubes is going to be the number 2 wide receiver for Green Bay. I mean, you're taking guys that are projecting for solid medians, yet we still have all this salary left over. So if we wanted to take Antonio Gibson, who I talked about earlier and you love, you still have $5,400 at tight end. And boy, oh boy, we can punt at tight end this week. So if we wanted to go here and take Christian McCaffrey, for example, and then go over here at tight end and punt there, there's plenty of names here that we can take, right? So if you wanted to go to that really expensive game and get access to that really high game total, then take a Mo Alley Cox right there at $3,000, right? These sort of lineups you can get to where you're taking like McCaffrey and Aaron Jones and a Justin Jefferson by getting to these sort of stacks. And it's not like the one punt I'll say is like the Mo Alley Cox, right? Like, it's not great. You'd rather maybe spend up a little bit more and get like an Evan Ingram or a Robert Tonyan if you're able to get to that sort of lineup. but it's far from the end all be all. It's far from the worst thing in the world, right? Having to take a tight end in a relatively high game total game. If he scores a touchdown, gets us 2 or 3 catches, that gets him into the optimal lineup. So I just wanted to go over and show you guys that, because this Green Bay Tampa Bay game, the ending of the B's in terms of the names there, could be worth a few looks for sure. Let's go over to this LA Rams versus Arizona game. It's yet another high total game. So it's really all of these high total 50 plus point total games that are taking all the attention away from games like even Philly versus Washington, a Detroit versus Minnesota is getting a little bit of attention, but it's games like this that are just going to get, especially for from the LA Rams side, because the Arizona is just getting torched by every team that they're playing at this point. Cooper Kupp is the highest owned player at wide receiver. So if you look at that, Cooper Kupp is 14% owned at this point and projects for 28 fantasy points. So it's for a good reason. He projects off the board in this sort of game. Some of it comes down to Van Jefferson being out, so a little bit more targets that are being funneled through him over the first few weeks. On the Arizona side, Rondale Moore was ruled out today. James Conner is still a game time decision. So you're going to have Dortch continue to get targets there for Arizona. A few other auxiliary players will also get targets for Arizona, such as, let's bring them up over here. So you had Dortch that we talked about. He's 4,300. AJ Green still gets targets at tight end. It's funneling a few more targets through Zach Ertz. Also, Trey McBride. People were really high on him going into the year. I would expect him to start to get targets here at some point. So maybe not this week. Maybe if Zach Ertz ends up going down at some point this year, Trey McBride's going to be in a great situation to smash. But 4,600 for Ertz is a fair enough price tag. Dortch at 4,300 you can use as a source of value. I'd much rather get to individual pieces of this game than stacking it outright, because even at quarterback, Kyler Murray has been a little bit inefficient to this point. He's going against a top tier defense. He's not getting a lot of ownership. So I'm going to have to keep an eye on this. So I don't want to put anything in stone here yet. So give me a second. I have him at 3% ownership right now. If that holds, if he's going to be the lowest owned quarterback above $6,500, which at this point, he's the lowest owned quarterback. Second lowest owned, by the way, for anybody out there wondering, is Justin Herbert. A lot of that's due to the injury concerns. Also, Joe Burrow is only 4.7% owned. If Kyler Murray is truly only going to be 3% owned at quarterback, then I'll consider it. I just don't know if that's going to hold. I think he's probably going to get a little bit more steam as the week goes on. People are going to realize that it's Kyler Murray, an absolute stud there, somebody who posted nearly 30 fantasy points a game last year through his first 12 games. We'll have to see. I think I'm talking myself into it there a little bit. So it'll come down to ownership. If he's low owned, I could see myself taking Murray, taking Marquise Brown and Ertz in a stack. I mean, running it back with Cooper Kupp, and you got yourself a little lineup running there, right? Especially if it's a low owned Kyler Murray. So just to give you an idea about this, because I'm genuinely curious about how much salary you have left at this point. Let's see where this puts you. So if we put Cooper Kupp in there and then we go to defense and just take a punt again, let's put the Commanders in there once again. We're left with $4,900 left per position. And we do have to take both running backs and wide receivers. So this is a premium stack. It takes up a lot of salary to get to this sort of build. But I could see 25, 30 points from Brown. I could see 30 points from Murray for sure. Ertz, 20 at tight end is usually a ceiling. So I think he's more than capable of getting there. And again, Cooper Kupp projects for over 28 fantasy points. And I have to say, it's viable. At running back, you're definitely going to have to find a few values. We talked about Gibson, who's not the worst idea. Ingram, if you have Kamara end up sitting, right, he probably worth a few looks in that role. And then you have to punt at wide receiver a little bit. So it's doable. It's a little bit salary constricting, which is probably why he's only going to be 3% owned. But assuming that we get some value that opens up from this Tampa Bay side or even the Green Bay side closer to lock, it might not be as hard to fit in those sort of stacks as we think. So we're going to have to keep an eye on ownership. Also, some of the injuries that open up over the week, because if we get a lot of salary, a lot of free squares that open up near $3,000 on the slate, could be really easy to get to that sort of stack. On the other side, everyone and anyone's going to play Cooper Kupp. We talked about that, but also Matthew Stafford. He's being projected at 7% ownership right now, which is not as high as Kirk Cousins. He's only $200 more expensive than him, but it's twice as much as Kyler Murray. It's nearly twice as much as Joe Burrow. He's 10 times higher owned as somebody like a Aaron Rodgers, and he's $100 more expensive. So you can't tell me that he's 10 times more likely than Aaron Rodgers to succeed. But just because I think that Aaron Rodgers is being underowned doesn't mean that I can't play Matthew Stafford too, right? So in that range there, we have Herbert, Murray, Cousins, Burrow, and Stafford. First off, I can tell you the piece of chalk I'm not playing there is Cousins, right? So I'm probably going to have to pick two of those quarterbacks to play between a Herbert, Murray, Burrow, and Stafford. Now, if Herbert is out, like a lot of the implied game totals out there, implied spreads end up kind of reflecting to us. If he ends up being out like they kind of hint at, then it's either going to be a Murray, Burrow, or Stafford. And it's, which one of those guys is going to get left out at that point, right? It's kind of a hard decision to make. I like Kyler Murray and whatnot, but Stafford and Burrow also have all of their advantages there too. It's going to be a hard decision to be made. So I just wanted to give you an idea. He's definitely in contention to be there in the stacking, but I'd say that Kyler Murray and then obviously a few of the other names that we've talked about are just a little bit higher on my priority list. The main reason why, just to give you an idea, right? If you thought that Kyler Murray was an expensive stack to take, look at this stack. So if you're going to take Matthew Stafford here, he's a little bit less expensive than Kyler Murray, but look at the rest of the lineup here. Cooper Kupp's relatively expensive. If you want to run it with Allen Robinson because Van Jefferson is out, and then as a buyback, go over here to Arizona and maybe take Marquise Brown, the elite tier option for that team. You're already left with $4,300. And if we go ahead and just plug in a defense like we did there before, take the Commanders, you're left with $4,900. So you're pretty much in the same situation, even with a less expensive quarterback as you were on the other team. So I don't know. It's still cost prohibitive, just like the Kyler Murray stack. And if Kyler Murray is going to be 3%, and if Matthew Stafford's going to be 7%, I might have to side with the Kyler Murray side there. So that's what I have to say about that game. Let's move on to the last one. It is Atlanta and Seattle, which is going to be super low owned. Nobody's going to touch this game. I've seen a couple people talk up Mariota at this point, which I understand. He brings a lot of rushing upside there, but it's a 42-point total. It's an even point spread. So kind of like the Tampa Bay Green Bay game. If you're looking for a close game, this is a game to keep an eye on. From the injury perspective, not much to speak about, at least from the fantasy relevancy perspective, nothing on either side. So in terms of value, there's not a lot to speak of. Also, just not great offenses. Like I said, people are getting to Mariota. I understand it because of the rushing upside, but who are you going to stack them with, right? Drake London, rookie. I mean, he's been decent to this point, but I mean, do we really count on 18 points a game going forward? Probably not. Tight end, Kyle Pitts, he makes a lot of sense to me, but is Mariota going to put up enough production at quarterback to sustain multiple wide receivers? I personally just like getting to Kyle Pitts on his own. He's one of my favorite value plays at tight end on the entire slate. Going over to Seattle, I like getting to Rashad Penny, right? Assuming maybe they have a lot of production on the ground. He hasn't been that productive through the first two games, but did see 12 attempts there in week one, only 6 last week because they were playing in such a bad game script against San Francisco. But if they can go out there and dominate this game on the ground, which, Atlanta is probably the softest opponent that they're going to get all year, Rashad Penny is capable of posting 30 fantasy points. And at $4,900, that is an absolute steal of a price tag. So guys like Penny, I talked about Pitts over here at $4,800. I love getting to individually, but if you're trying to sell me on a Marcus Mariota stack, or you're trying to sell me over here on a Geno Smith stack, I mean, get right. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to make that sort of fish play out here this week. I think it pretty much is about a fish play as you can do. I mean, it's a relatively low total game, low efficiency offenses, not the greatest stacking options. Truly, if you're stacking either Geno Smith or going to Marcus Mariota, it's a pure dart throw. It's a low-owned dart throw, right? Whereas if we take a look at the pricing board, just to give you an idea, at quarterback, $5,500, you have Marcus Mariota there. Why not just take Justin Fields against Houston, right? It's another relatively close total game between Houston and the Bears. And Justin Fields brings that same sort of rushing upside to the total on table. I don't know, I'd rather take Justin Fields. Or Trevor Lawrence in a relatively close total. Again, just a 3-point spread against the Chargers. Or even going to a little bit higher up the board, right, and taking Jared Goff, right? If you spend $300 more expensive, you can take Jared Goff, who's in that total game against Minnesota Vikings. So I don't know. I see where people are coming from when they mentioned the stacks here with that last game, but I just think with all the other top-end options on the board, you probably have better options that you can be getting to. But that is all I've got for this stream. Just wanted to walk through you guys game by game, get you guys an idea of what to be thinking about here going into Sunday. We're doing the same stream here next week at 7 p.m. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. And also tomorrow, we'll have top stacks dropping tonight and a value picks video dropping on tomorrow, probably tomorrow AM, maybe tomorrow PM. At some point, though, those 2 videos dropping for you guys. And then on Sunday, if you're part of the Patreon page, make sure to hop in the Discord server. We'll be chatting it up all morning there, talking about the injuries, any last-second ownership notes, stacking options, any live questions, all of that sort of fun stuff to give you guys an idea of what you need to do to make your lineups. But until then, guys, best of luck with all of your builds, all of your lineups for this week, and let's get this cash.